All right, welcome back to Classroom Chats with Crystal, a podcast for new educators seeking to define their teacher identity, oftentimes through trial and error. Well, it's interview season, it's graduation season, and the focus of today's show will be on interviewing, landing that job that you want, or at least the job that you think that you want. So if you're a recent graduate, congratulations. I know that you have worked very hard, and at this point you may be a bit nervous because now all you have to do is get a job. You graduated and now it's real. I know in this season it probably looks a little different because majority of you either attended virtual graduations or graduation has been postponed altogether. But nevertheless, you're now in the market for a job and you want to be a teacher. So as you already know, you completed your internship if you are a education major. If you're not an education major, you will apply to the state or you're about to apply to your state so that you can get your particular license and you're seeking a job. So let's just start there. If for some reason you haven't already applied to the state and got your teaching license, interviewing for a job is going to be quite interesting. Oftentimes, employers, principals, assistant principals who are going to be interviewing you, it's quite a disappointment to interview someone you want to hire and then you find out that they don't actually have their certification. So what you'll find is that if it's not listed on your resume or if you don't have a copy of it, you may not even get an interview. But if you do get the interview, please note that it is disappointing to find out that the person that's sitting across the table from you doesn't have a certification. So that's going to be one of the first things that you're going to do is make sure that you've applied to the state. You might have a letter of eligibility because you've never taught before, but that's what we want to see and that's what we want to hear. In some counties, they do have major teacher job fairs around this time of the year because the school year is coming to a close and we're looking to staff for next year. With that in mind, oftentimes those particular job fairs, or whether they're virtual or in person, depending on our current climate, they're going to look for your certification. Okay, they oftentimes they don't even allow people without a certification to walk in the doors. So you want to make sure that you have that squared away right away. All right, now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about applying for jobs. Applying for jobs, typically you go to the district sponsored system, you look for open positions across your district and you select those that you're interested in based off your qualifications, your credentials, the location that you would like to be in, etc. In addition to applying through the sponsored system, what you want to do also is to reach out to the school direct. Schools receive tons of resumes from teachers all over the country. With that in mind, you want to make sure that you stand out to a certain extent. You don't want to get lost in the mix. The way that you do that is you send an email to the principal, copy the secretary. In some occasions, applicants, they email the principal and the assistant principals that are listed on the homepage, and they send an email indicating that they're interested, letting them know what their credentials and qualifications are, as well as their experiences and what they'll bring to the school. What this will do for you is really allow for you to stand out. I can't say that other candidates won't do this because they do. However, the vast majority do not. So that gives you the opportunity to get a response. And sometimes that response is, thank you so much for sending me your resume. We're looking at applicants and we'll be in touch. Other times it goes a little different where they actually reach out and say, what time would you be available? Or which day can you come in? Or we're interested in interviewing you today. You never know. So that's one thing that you want to do. Sometimes new teachers, they're a little leery of it. They trust the system and that they apply and they wait on a phone call. But you want to make sure that you go the extra mile. You really are going to have to do your due diligence here. Although, as we see on the news and hear all around us, there is a teacher shortage, but you are still going to have to do your due diligence because although there's a teacher shortage, when principals and assistant principals interview potential candidates, we don't hire people just because we have a shortage. So we are still looking for candidates of quality for the most part. So with that in mind, you're going to want to make sure that you show up at the interview prepared. We're looking for specifics, and when you're a new teacher, there oftentimes I'm going to get into what we look for and what some of our greatest concerns are. But you want to make sure that you are prepared. So how do you prepare? First off, my recommendation is that you need to go back to your internship and take a look at that feedback. Having been a supervising teacher, even in the role of assistant principal, I was able to observe the intern several times, as a matter of fact. And at every occasion, I was giving her feedback, because in those instances, we are able to kind of pinpoint and identify your growth areas. And we give specific feedback to help you grow in those areas. Just because your internship is over doesn't mean that your growth areas have, magically disappeared. Focus on the feedback that was given and start to do a little research. Okay, research could be in the form of how the lessons that followed that feedback came from various teachers' sites, maybe even from your education books and education tasks. Just go back and just kind of dive into those things, because you didn't sit in those classes and get all that information just to shelve it and to not use it again. It's there for a reason. So go ahead and pick those books up, pick that feedback up, and really just dive into your growth areas and also your strengths, because you want to be able to talk up those strengths. You're going to be honest about your growth areas, but you're going to want to make sure that you talk up your strengths, because when we're interviewing someone and you're very self-aware of what you're good at, and we can see what you're going to bring to the school or to the team, we know that that's a starting point for us. So you want to know and be familiar with both of those areas. In addition to taking a look at that intern feedback, one avenue for doing research would be, go ahead and join educator forums. There are educator Facebook pages. I'm pretty sure that there are other educator forums on different social media platforms. But on Facebook alone, there are so many that you can just go ahead and jump into. There are thousands of educators on these forums, and you nowadays are at an advantage where you can just throw a question out there and we decide whether or not we're going to, answer. Sometimes we reach back, like to pay it forward, and we understand and remember what it's like to be interviewing for a job, because no one ever really likes that process, and to become a new teacher and all of the anxiety that surrounds that. So make sure you jump into some of those forums. Another recommendation would be to talk to your supervising teacher, especially if you're having a difficult time pinpointing what your strengths as well as your growth areas are. Hopefully during your internship, he or she was able to give you a little insight on that. But it might be a good idea to just have a conversation with them and say, hey, Mr. and Miss So-and-so, I am applying for jobs, and I really do, since you watched me teaching in the classroom with students, with planning, all things education. Can you please give me some guidance as to where I should start, or if you need to know what your strengths are, what they saw in you? Because sometimes we're able to see strengths in our interns or, developing professionals, and you haven't yet discovered those strengths. So it might be worth the conversation. Another thing that you're going to want to do in this interview is really just be specific. A lot of times new teachers walk into the interview, and I know you're nervous, okay, and that's not going to change. The people that are interviewing you know that you're nervous. It's expected. We look over all of those things. However, you want to make sure that you're being specific. Sometimes when you get a little nervous, you forget what to say. You don't remember all of the things that you were engaged in. So one thing that you can do that would help you with this is to, when you start applying, and especially when you start getting an interview, or if you're going to attend a job fair, just go ahead and write down all of the experiences that you had during your internship. Write them down. If you worked in small group with students based off of the data that the teacher collected, right, then that's something you're going to want to speak to. If you were able to plan if you're able to plan a lesson for students where they were collaborating, having possible, student accountable talk on whatever the specifics were of those assignments and tasks that you actually owned and took lead on, you're going to want to make sure that you speak to them, because that is experience. We want to know that you have some experience in this area, and that you see how it translates into the classroom. Because what you will find is that it is very different to be the teacher in the room versus the second teacher. So you're going to want to lean on those experiences, because they were there for a reason. Okay. You learn how to deliver, how to monitor whether or not students are assessed, whether or not students understand what you're teaching. You learn how to develop assessments and to be a member of a professional learning community, so that you can speak to those things and so that you can implement them when you actually walk into the classroom. So my recommendation to you is to make a list of all of the significant experiences that you've had in the classroom, so that you will be able, number one, to remember them. They should be at the forefront. If you've made a list, it could be a bulleted list. If you want, you can actually do more than bulleted and kind of paragraph it, so that it's kind of etched into your mind, so that it's at the forefront. Sometimes we do a lot of things that we don't even remember doing, because we just do them. Okay, maybe you had an amazing supervising teacher where you soaked up so much information just by being in his or her presence. And it might be something that you don't remember until you start to actually jot down everything that occurred during your internship. So go ahead and make a bulleted list. It is not frowned upon to have a list of experiences in like maybe a portfolio that you carry into the interview, just as a sheet, so that when you're having the conversation, you can have your portfolio open with a bulleted list of things that you want to make sure that you highlight and bring up about you and your experiences in the classroom, even with no experience. That speaks to a certain level of awareness and competency, and even a mindset where you are already an educator versus someone who is quote becoming an educator. And so bring that bulleted list in. If you think that for some reason when you get nervous, your frontal lobe shut down, you forget things, then have that bulleted list. This is not to say, though, that you are to read verbatim from the bulleted list. Or, as I was in an interview one time, we had a candidate just hand us a sheet of paper, and as we asked questions, he's like, it's on the paper. So essentially, he just told us to read his paper that he wrote, and of course, we didn't call him back, and that interview was short-lived. So it's something you're going to want to, internalize, but at the same time, if you know you're going to be so flustered that you will forget things, just go ahead and print it out, put it in your portfolio, make it big enough for you to glance down and read it, so that you'll be able to answer the questions without having so much regret. You don't want to get back to the car and be like, oh my God, I forgot to mention. Okay, so that's a major tip that a lot of people don't actually take advantage of. You're going to be nervous. Just be your nervous self, okay? You're going to be nervous. We expect you to be nervous. Some people, they, do different things. And we see a lot of fidgeting. Oftentimes, since we know you're going to be nervous, we overlook those things. But just understand that we know that you're going to be nervous, and don't let that discourage you in the process, because sometimes people get nervous, they start to fumble, and then they want to really shut down in the middle of the interview where they're like, oh no, I'm not getting this job. I just stuttered through the last 3 questions. We're looking for quality and content, right? And we understand that you're nervous. You're hoping that you get an offer from the other side of the table. And quite frankly, as the interviewer, we're hoping to get, quality responses so that we can have a quality hire for the most part. Be honest. You are not expected to be an expert. You are expected to be a new teacher. Okay? You are not expected to be an expert. There's a saying that goes around that just so inaccurate in my mind. It's not anything that I really believe in, but it says fake it until you make it. That's a little uncomfortable. It's nerve-wracking just to pretend to know something that you don't. I ask a lot of questions, and I know I get teased about it sometimes in meetings, but I ask questions, so that I can get answers. And once I have answers, then I'm able to not only be competent in whatever it is that I'm doing, but I'm also able to help others around me. If there's something that comes up that you are just unfamiliar with, just go ahead and do your best to answer it to the best of your ability, but don't shy away from really explaining that you're looking to grow and develop in those areas, because you understand that it'll help you grow and develop as a professional. And you could talk about the different ways that it can help you grow. Just to give a outlook that you have a growth mindset and that you're going to be coachable, because that is also something that we look for in new teachers. We're not interested in new teachers who think that they know everything under the sun. We all know that as a new teacher, it's going to take some time. Teaching is an art. Yes, you went to school, you learned the science. Maybe you got to dabble a little bit in the arts during your internship, but quite frankly, it's an art. And in order to develop your art, it takes time. It's not going to be anything that you're going to blink your eye and, hey, it's done. No, everyone knows that you don't start feeling the ground beneath your feet as a new teacher until about 3 years. And then at 5 years, you're like, hey, I think I might have this thing. I'm not saying that you don't grow during those 3 to 5 years, but it's expected that there will be growth, consistent growth and progress. So when you're in the room, don't fake it till you make it. Be honest about the areas that you would like to grow in, so that we know that you're coachable and know that you're realistic. Because what you don't want to do is paint a picture that you are a know-it-all who cannot be coached and you think that you've arrived even though you've never held a teaching position. To potential questions that may occur during the interview. Of course, I won't give you the whole list of questions that we ask, but I'm going to give you questions that should be no-brainers, but oftentimes when new teachers walk into the interview, they haven't really thought about the answer to those questions. So let me give you a little bit of advice and a little bit of feedback. The number one concern that we have when we sit across the table from a potential teacher is, how are they going to really serve our students and make a significant impact in their lives in regard to learning and development. So there's no way that you can successfully influence student achievement if you do not have classroom management. The entire time we are interviewing you, we are asking ourselves if you'll be able to make it in the classroom. And by make it, we mean have a solid classroom management plan that will allow you to even teach. Because if the classroom is chaotic, if children are not listening, if you really have no classroom presence, it doesn't matter how much you know about biology or language arts, because you'll never be able to teach it to children. So when you go into the interview, you need to have a very firm grip on what you believe your classroom management plan is going to be. Of course, I say what you believe because in real life, when you walk into the classroom, we know that you have 125 plus different students. We put them together in different ways, so the dynamics of each class is very different. So it's like a living management plan, because it will grow and develop based off the students that are before you. But you need to have some idea of how you're going to address behaviors that occur in the classroom. It's 2020, and we do not have cookie cutter classrooms. It doesn't look like the Leave It or Beave It classroom. It's a real place. Neither, for the most part, does it look like Dangerous Minds. But if you don't have a classroom management plan in place, then it is very difficult for you to get anything done. So one of the questions we ask is, what's your classroom management plan going to look like? How will you address unwanted behaviors? And we're looking for something other than, well, I'm going to call administration. No, ma'am. No, sir. We do understand that at some point administration will need to be called because you've exhausted everything in your behavior management plan, but it should never start there. We have some candidates that come in and what they say is, I'll tell the student to stop and then I'll call administration. We're not doing that because that says that you're so willing to give away your authority in the classroom without much effort or energy. So you're going to want to have a defined classroom management plan. How are you going to introduce routines and procedures to students? You need to be very well aware that we have to teach routines and procedures. If we teach routines and procedures, go over expectation, model routines, model procedures, have students follow that model repeatedly, then it is very difficult for you to have routines and procedures in place that will curb unwanted behaviors. So that's the first thing that you're going to want to look into as well as to mention. Secondly, every educator knows that you must have a relationship with kids. So in your classroom management plan, of course, one thing that they mention is involving students in the development of your classroom rules and expectations. Somewhat like rules of engagement are a family agreement as to what behaviors lend themselves to a classroom that everyone can feel safe in and learn in versus the behaviors that do not. And most importantly, what will be the outcome if those particular rules of engagement are broken? And you need to have potential responses that you can speak to. One bit of advice when it comes to a classroom management plan is that there's a resource called Intervention Central. Not many educators I know ever reference it, but it is one of my favorites. And the reason that it is one of my favorites is because it speaks to various types of interventions, from behavior management to academics, to even social. So it's a place that you want to go and spend a little time in, because they talk about behavior contracts, they talk about potential consequences, how to engage students with positive reinforcements, just a wealth of information that you could use and be able to speak to. That doesn't mean you're going to go in and you're going to speak to everything on the website. Choose a couple of bits of information that you really do, not faking it for the interview, but you really do believe that will work in your classroom, that you feel will suit your teaching style, your personality, the way that you envision your classroom to run, and just really look into those strategies a little more and be ready to talk about how that would play a role in your classroom management plan. Classroom management is big, big, big. If you speak to your content, then we're happy about that. But if we think that you cannot handle discipline in the classroom, then we'll be a little leery to offer you the job. The second thing that you're going to want to be able to speak to is, what would a lesson look like in your classroom from beginning to end? We want to know what your opening activities are going to be. We want to know what your closing activities are going to be. We want to know what the core of your lesson is going to look like. How are you going to facilitate the lesson itself? So what you don't want to do is to say, oh, well, kids will come in, they'll be quiet, and they'll get started on bell work. Number one, let's get real. Okay, the reason we have opening activities or bell work tasks is really so that kids can refocus after transition time. Because we understand that it takes about 6 minutes or so for kids to come back to us to be able to settle and be in the right frame of mind for us to move forward. So one thing you're going to want to really know is that we're looking for specifics. When we ask these questions, we are looking for specifics. So if there's something that you start with, your opening activity always introduces or previews the lesson that is to come, or it reviews the lesson from the day before, you may speak to that. Then maybe, for instance, you start with every day a political cartoon, and kids are to annotate that political cartoon. In addition to that, once they're finished with that activity, they may move into Think, Pair, Share, where they are talking to their neighbor. You are selecting a couple of individuals to share outs. Then you review the learning goals. for that particular class session and talk about really the purpose of that lesson and how it connects to the lesson from the previous day. At which point you move into the strategies that you use to introduce new content. If it's not new content, how do you revisit what was taught before, and how do you ease or transition students into practicing and applying the new information that you gave? It's strategy, strategy, strategy. And the big question is, how are you going to know? What are you going to do in your classroom, not after, okay, while kids are learning, to know that they are meeting the target? How do you, as we say, quote, monitor, close quote, that students are understanding? When I was in school, I think the teachers called it check for understanding. All right. We would complete something. The teachers would look at it when we leave. We're not doing that. As educators, it is expected that we are assessing student progress in the learning process, not after it has already occurred. It's a lot easier for you, and you would think this would be a no-brainer, to correct students in the process versus waiting until they've done something incorrect for the entire day or the entire class period, and then that particular error has been, fortified, and the next day you have to come and undo all of that through reteaching. So monitoring kids throughout the learning process is major. How do you do that? Right? You're visiting student groups, you're listening to discussions, you're reading student answers as they're working through independent practice, and you're posing questions to students. You're giving them feedback, and that allows them to really articulate what has been taught or what they're learning, or even to help them revise what they have on that paper or what they're saying in that classroom discussion. In addition to that, just circulating and listening to students and reading papers. Are you working with children in small groups? So you notice that you have a few students who may have been struggling with the concept during the opening activity. And when you're released for independent practice, you are working with those 3 or 4 students for a few minutes together, starting to work with them so that you can help them begin the process. Then you're jumping to different student clusters or different students to monitor those students as well, while those students are working independently on what you started them with. So really, what does your teaching look like? Okay, what is your flow? All right, it should be so that I remember as I taught the adults for this part, I conducted professional development for about 130 teachers every week in some capacity. And I remember one session, one of the teachers, she was already on this digital tool that I use, which was Socrative at the time. And I said, how do you know we're going to go to Socrative? And she said, because you always go to Socrative at the end, because there's an exit ticket where you take our responses about the learning and ask us to apply it. And I laughed and I said, wow. Okay, I see. So what I realized is that I'm pretty consistent. I had a strategy for most things. So just even working with adults and teaching adults, it was very important for me to have a flow. A flow helped me as the educator, and it really helps the students understand the purpose of the lesson and where we're headed in that lesson. So even still with that particular flow, I would always start with a short, engaging clip where I was then ease into the learning goal and task with a thoughtful question. Then I'll ease into an activity that led us to the core of the content. Then we would have, I would deliver what I would call like lecture bites from different resources gathered. Then there would be independent practice, and then there would be the sharing of that learning before we move to the exit ticket so that I can reevaluate individually. So everyone, and another thing that I like to mention is that, and then while everyone was working, I had a system for how I rotated around the room in order to listen to the groups so that I could read particular responses so that I can tap into different discussions, especially when I know that certain people don't share out loud. It also gave an opportunity for me to go ahead and select people to respond, because I know By telling them in advance, they'll be a little bit more likely to share with the group versus not sharing at all. So you need to understand what your flow is going to be like. Potential lesson flow and design. Okay, what will your lesson look like from beginning to end? One thing that you most likely probably spent a little time working with in your internship is data. In education, we are data driven. Teaching is an art, but there is also a science to this. And it is difficult for you to help students by throwing everything out and hoping that it sticks. That is difficult and it is not effective. With that in mind, the decisions that you make in your classroom need to be data driven. So there will be a question in regard to how you're going to use data to differentiate, or how you're going to use data to really drive your instruction, because the data should drive everything that you do. Okay, if you don't remember anything else about data, that's what you need to know. One thing to note is that when we start talking about assessments and data, a lot of new teachers assume that they're just the test that you take at the end of a unit, or after you've learned the concept, you take a quiz. Not at all. We collect data as educators throughout the lesson, each day, every week. And then, yes, we have those formal assessments like the quizzes and the tests, but you should be collecting student data from the very beginning of that class period or class day till it even concludes. So earlier we talked about a lesson flow, and you say maybe you do a previewing activity that helps students preview what is coming up in the lesson for that day. Just by reviewing the responses of the students, whether it was through student accountable talk, where they had to write a response and then share, you listened and you read those responses as you circulated around the room. That's a data point. Okay, the student discussions, data points. The written responses, data points. Okay, the conversations that you're having with the students in small groups, data points. Your exit ticket, and if you don't know what an exit ticket is, that means it's a small assignment that students are asked to complete at the end of the class. Okay, they complete it, they give it to you in order to exit the room. Then you take those particular exit tickets and you sort them to see which students accomplished the mission or met the target, which students did not, and which students were almost there at target, so that you know how to differentiate your lessons the next day. That moves me to the next thing that you need to be ready to answer. And you need to be ready to talk about how you're going to differentiate your instruction, and how are you going to, and by that I mean, how are you going to help students who are performing at different levels? Classrooms are not cookie cutter. They never have been. They never will be. Don't expect it. In every meeting that you're in, or even in the classes that you just finished, it should be very clear that everyone receives and processes information differently, and oftentimes at different paces, and sometimes at very different paces, and that's okay. We all learn specific to us. So in the classroom, we do very much expect teachers to be aware of this, and to not think that you can plan one lesson and expect for all of your students in the room to get it at the same time. We expect for you to think about what you're going to do if Johnny just doesn't seem to understand the concept. Susie understood it before she walked in the room, and Bobby probably just needs one guiding question from you before he'll be there. What will you do? How will you differentiate? How will you help the students who are underperforming, performing at target, and those who are performing above target? Earlier I talked about small group. Okay, so when it comes down to releasing students to do independent work, you can have formal or informal small groups where you're able to differentiate. What that means is that you take the data that you collect and you group students. It could be done, and this is something that you can tell students or not tell students, even though they often find out whether or not you verbalize it. But what you would do is you would group students based off of the data. It could be through seating arrangement where they're all seated in a particular area. Maybe you group the students so that they're mixed ability groups. But regardless, you've taken some thought and care into your seating arrangement and the groups that kids are going to be in when they move into independent practice or even small group with you. When you do those things, you have the ability to differentiate what you're doing. The conversation of differentiating instruction is a totally different one, but in those different groups, you can differentiate by content, by process, or product. So maybe the process will look different with your group A when they're working with you in the small group, but then when they transition to independent group, they have the same product that they have to complete as all the other students. However, you taught them a different way to get there. So you just have to be prepared to talk about how you're going to serve students at different levels because they are there. And then in addition to that, what are you going to do for the students who already mastered the target before they walked in? Okay. How will you differentiate? Will you differentiate their product, meaning their outcome is going to look a lot different versus just giving them extra work because they already knew it? Extra work does not equate to extra learning. It could just simply be extra work. So you have to think about and be ready to respond to how are you going to differentiate for students based off of the different levels. There will be questions about relationship building because that does play into really how you're able to influence children. If you don't have a relationship with the students, it's very difficult for you to reach them. A lot of children do not like learning from people that they just simply don't like, or people they feel don't care about them. In my book, Connecting with Students, there are several activities that you can try. And this is not to say that you don't know how to be a people person, but sometimes connecting with students is difficult for some individuals. But in my book, Connecting with Students, there are many options for how you can do that from the very first day of school. So there, I believe you can probably preview it on different outlets. Just Google it, Connecting with Students, Crystal Higgs, and you will be able to go ahead and get a couple ideas on how you do that. Typically in an interview, we ask that question: how are you going to build relationships with students, okay, and their families? And because we all know that if you have no relationship with students, very little learning occurs. So you're going to want to be prepared to answer that as well. The last thing that you need to be prepared to answer, which should be and possibly will be a great bulk of the interview, would be: how do you prepare standards-based lessons? New teachers sometimes don't understand the importance of planning, and lesson planning not only leads to effective instruction, but it lessens the opportunities students have to misbehave in your classroom. If you don't have a lesson plan, students will plan for you. And trust me, it will not be the plans that you had in mind. So the number one thing that we are most interested in is how you're going to deliver your instruction. And if you don't know what standards-based instruction is, standards-based instruction is referring to the learning standards released by your state that students are supposed to learn in your content area. If you don't know what those are, I would recommend starting to look at them in your particular content area so that you'll be able to speak to them. And if you're asked to give an example lesson of how you would teach something, you would be able to start with the standard and how you will address that particular standard through instruction and instructional strategies. If you spend the time looking up standards for your content area from your state, they give ideas and suggestions as to what instruction would look like. They give you the limitations of that particular standard. They give you what students should already know and where that particular standard falls in the progression of learning for students. They'll give you sample lesson plans, and those sample lesson plans can really give you a greater understanding and picture of what it looks like to teach a particular concept in the classroom. It's something that you may have done during your internship, but you may have had help planning it for the most part, or your supervising teacher did a lot of those things. So you're going to want to make sure that you spend some time becoming intimate with those standards, because we don't teach books. We don't teach movies. Okay? We don't even really teach concepts. What we teach are standards, the academic standards tied to that particular content area. So we start with the standard, and you need to be able to speak to your understanding that we teach the learning standards for the content area. Get familiar with them, because not only is it beneficial to know them in an interview, you're going to need them when you're in the classroom, because our learning targets and our purpose for every lesson goes right back to the standards for your content area. If we have an interview and you give us all this nice, fluffy, sprinkly stuff about building relationships, having this awesome classroom management plan, but yet you don't realize that you should teach the content standards that students need to know, then there's no way that we're going to offer you a job, because we need someone in there who is going to help students achieve. Student achievement is always our number one priority. This particular podcast with this last bit of advice: please do research on the school that you're going to be interviewing at. Even if it is a teacher job fair, you typically pre-register. You know which schools you're interested in, because it's typically some school that is close to your neighborhood. Maybe it's a short drive. Maybe it's a Title I school or a non-Title I school. It's a school that got your attention for some reason. So what I recommend is just spending a little time researching the school itself, because we want to know why you want to be employed at our school, and how are you going to serve our students, their families, and the community. And if you know nothing about our students, that gives us very little reason to think that you will connect with them well. And if you can't make connections with the students, the families, or the community, it's going to be very difficult to share all of that knowledge that you have. So you're going to want to research the school. We're quite impressed when teachers walk in, they understand the state of our school. Nowadays, you can find information from the district website, the school's website. They sometimes have school report cards where you can get an overview. You can even go to the state to find out how the school is performing in your particular content area. But we want to know that you've taken the time and you have selected us, because we want to select you specifically, and we hope that you, it's a mutualistic relationship. Okay, so if I know it sounds a little cliche, but you need to know about the school. When we ask that last question of, do you have any questions for us? We're not expecting for you to ask about our school demographics, how we're doing in relation to the data, because all of those things we hope that you've researched and that you've looked into. Can you ask questions that tie back to those areas? Sure. But you don't want to give us an indication that you took no time at all to even research who we are, what our mission is, and how we go about serving the students, the families, and the community. When you walk into that interview, just understand that you are not expected to be an expert. We understand that we're not interviewing a veteran. You are expected to be a new teacher, but you are expected to be a new teacher who is prepared for the interview and who's taken the time to research how you can be of service to our students, our families, and the community. Thank you for spending time with me today here on Classroom Chats with Crystal.